seminal Russia-Ukraine conflict has gone into a winter stasis, into a winter pause. But the war is not at all over. In fact, if anything, the anticipation is that it could easily intensify in the months ahead. The simple fact is that prior to the winter setting in, the Russians had ordered partial mobilization because they were running desperately short of manpower. They had started the war with 150,000. They had called it, Putin had called it a special operation, and as such the Russians had kept their force levels confined to this 150,000 top line, and they had trenchantly refused to increase or enhance their manpower. They had perhaps thought that they would be able to utilize their tremendous edge in firepower, especially in artillery firepower and air power, to overcome the Ukrainian superiority in terms of numbers. The simple fact is that the differential in numbers was far too pronounced to be overcome by any level of technological superiority that the Russians may have had. The fact is, even that technological superiority, bar the artillery component, was not there. Was not there because of the simple fact that the Americans, the NATO, were trying to match the Russians weapon for weapon, weapon system for weapon system, and there was a kind of a technological equivalence on the battlefield. Don't forget the fact that Ukraine is not a pushover. Ukraine is the second largest country in Europe and has one of the largest reserves of minerals and strategic elements in its borders. It is a oil producing, gas producing country. It is got the largest grain reserves. It exports grains to the world, fertilizers to the world, and as such the match was fairly even. With this, the era of low intensity conflicts, the asymmetric wars that we had seen in the last couple of decades has come to an end. What we are now witnessing is complete equivalence between a kind of a symmetric balance between the two opponents. And this is creating a wholly different new ball game on the battlefield. The lessons that we had learned from the era of low intensity conflicts, the lessons we had learned from the era of asymmetric wars, America attacking Iraq, America attacking Vietnam, America attacking Libya, Syria. I mean, these kind of pushover states, when there was absolutely no competition, there was no equivalence between the two sides, that is now passé, that is now over. The world has to now adjust to the Clausewitzian era of evenly matched opponents, fighting to the bitter end. Wars will increasingly be a test of stamina. So with this as a backdrop, I will use my new book, Russia-Ukraine War Lessons Learned, which has just come out this month, to try and analyze what has happened so far, and from there extrapolate as to where exactly are we headed, where are we going in the current conflict. So first, a word about what are the aspects that I have covered on my book, which will contribute to forecasting about the future of this conflict. We started this conflict with a war game we had conducted before the start of the conflict. That means we had then tried to match the force levels, we had tried to do a net assessment and forecast how this war would last, what would the war aims be. And we had then deduced that the war aims of Russia would be to wreck Ukraine and to grab about the Russian-speaking areas of this country, as also to try and create a land bridge towards Crimea. we then tried to match anticipated outcomes with actual outcomes, and we found that not only we but a whole lot of other institutional establishments, the Pentagon included, the Russians included, had gone very, very wrong in terms of the time estimates. We were absolutely spot on in terms of Russian war aims. The Russians then spelt out their war aims as a special military operations designed to, impose major attrition on the Ukrainian armed forces and to denazify Ukraine, which perhaps was a euphemism for regime change. So that did happen, but the estimates of the duration of the war was, if the Russians had fought in the classical Russian way of war fighting, that was characterized at the end of World War II by massive tank attacks in echelons, first echelon, second echelon, third echelons. The Russians, when the first echelon was used up to 70%, they would throw in the second echelon. Then that was used up, they would throw in the third echelon. They would then use the operational maneuver group to break out towards depth areas. They would use a very heavy preponderance of artillery firepower, wheel-to-wheel artillery, mass the tubes, tube artillery, rocket artillery, free rockets. The Katyushas were called the Stalin organs in the Second World War. So mass and scale, these two words, mass and scale, describe the Russian way of war fighting. What we have seen in this conflict is the exact opposite. We have not seen the Russian way of war, based upon which most forecasts had been made. The Russians attacked Ukraine with just 150,000 troops, right? And the Russians, refused to increase or enhance this force level till the last month of this war. Till almost after 9 months of the war, they trenchantly refused to enhance their force levels, saying that Putin had called it a special operation and it would so remain special. They would not transit from hybrid war to full-scale war. Now this hybrid war thing we must understand. About 10 years back, the Russian General Gerasimov, who's now the Chief of Staff, he had come out with the Gerasimov doctrine of hybrid warfare, whole of government warfare, in which they would use a mix of information warfare, cyber warfare, economic warfare, diplomatic, legal warfare, combined with kinetic warfare, and possibly the threat of weapons of mass destruction, etc., to wage across the spectrum war, but which was largely remained confined to the hybrid war level. What we are seeing in this war is the tension between the Gerasimov doctrine and the classical Russian way of war fighting. So, what left the rest of the world perplexed was, why did the Russians opt for this? At great disadvantage to themselves, at great cost to their military reputation. It is absolutely, incomprehensible why they should have chosen this course of action, which at times seemed to defy military common sense. The standard military ratios for attack are 1:3. To attack a platoon, you need a company you need a battalion, brigade, and so on. 1:3 is the standard ratio. When the Russians attacked 250,000 strong Ukrainian forces with just 150,000 strong Russian armed forces, a Russian group of forces in Ukraine, it made little sense. The only saving grace perhaps was that they would use their military technological superiority, their mass of their air power, their mass of tactical ballistic missiles, cruise missiles. They would employ the drones, etc., to try and pulverize the Ukrainians and try and make up for the lack of Russian military manpower. But They persisted with this military manpower differential when the Ukrainians, for their side, they enhanced their manpower, they mobilized, they ordered full mobilization, they treated it as full-scale war, which it was, and they increased their force levels to over 400,000. Some estimate put their Ukrainian force levels mobilized to 700,000 in uniform. Not all of them may have been well armed and equipped, but they claim to have done about at least 400,000 men in arms, proper equipped, armed and equipped by the Americans, by the NATO countries. And therefore, this created quite an anomalous situation for the Russians. The amazing factor is that the Russians, because of their superiority in artillery firepower, superiority in missile power, were able to carry it for so long, pull it off for so long. I think half the time they were saved by the sheer military reputation. People thought they must be having a lot more up their sleeves, and therefore the Ukrainians were cautious. Their advisors, the American and the NATO, were very cautious. But then when towards the end of the war, the last few months, they realized that that is all that Russia had put forth, and they were not willing to commit any more forces. And this opened up huge vulnerabilities. The Russian forces were doing firefighting. They were rushing from one sector to the other to plug the gaps, to try and gain some local advantages, and in the bargain they were tiring out their troops. For example, let's take it a look from the very beginning. The first major attack with 4 corps or 4 combined armies was on Kyiv and on Kharkiv. That failed. Then they withdrew their troops and they were able to get a clean break, which is quite amazing, because the same clean break they were not able to get in Kharkiv later, because by that time the Americans, the Ukrainians, the NATO had become wise to how the Russians were operating. And when the Russians withdrew from Kyiv and Kharkiv and they focused on the Donbass, well, that was one particular move. Then suddenly the Americans and the Americans armed the Ukrainians heavily. NATO supplied them weapons, and the Ukrainians started threatening to do the long advertised offensive in Kherson. As a result of that offensive, the Russians were forced to pull out about 30,000 troops from the Donbass, send it to Kherson. Now, when they felt they had stabilized the situation somewhat in the Kherson, they wanted to resume the offensive in the Donbass. The only way they had to do it was to pull troops out of the Kharkiv sector. So they started pulling troops out of the Kharkiv sector, and as they were doing so, 75 American and NATO military satellites, 250 civilian satellites. They picked up every single truck, tank, soldier which was being moved out. They told the Ukrainians, and as the Russians were withdrawing from the Kharkiv sector to the line of the Oskil River to reduce the manpower they would need to defend that area, the Ukrainians quickly mobilized 3 brigades and launched a quick pursuit operation in the wake of the withdrawing Russians. Now, this was a PR disaster. Optically, it gave the impression that the Ukrainians had routed the Russians. The fact was the Russians were already on the withdrawal because of their paucity of troops. They had to borrow from Peter to pay Paul. They had to pull troops out from here to guard there. They had to pull troops out from there to attack in that other sector. How long could this go on? And quite obviously, in the month of November, it came to absolute, the untenability of it all became so very apparent. And there was outcry in the right-wing military circles in Russia, and they thumped the table and they forced Putin and the general staff now to order partial mobilization. There was a lot of discussion even then whether the mobilization should be full or partial. The announcement was delayed, etc. Finally, the Russians opted for partial mobilization. They called in 300,000 reservists. Some of them were trained, and about 80,000 who were better trained or better equipped, the better component of the reservists, they were straight away sent to the battlefields to stabilize the front in Kherson, in Kharkiv, in Donbass, where they were running woefully short of troops. So they have now stabilized the situation. They made a concession to common sense by when the new Russian general in charge, General Sergei, or Air Force general, ruthless general, he straight away decided that holding forces across the line of the Dnieper with the bridges blown up by the HIMARS was untenable, and it was not of much value, that they could still deny the port of Kherson if they held the east bank of the Dnieper river. So he withdrew all forces to the east bank of the Dnieper river, which made military common sense. Now the Russian defenses are largely based on river lines, which are far easier and more economical to defend. The Russian reservists, less the 80,000 that have been already deployed, the rest are under training, and it is now anticipated that the Russians will now have a pause for the winter to rest and recoup their troops, to train them properly, the new inductees who are coming in, make sure they are integrated into the units and formations. Last time their major problem was the infantry, and now it is hoped that they will try and get in better equipped, better trained infantry, because in the absence of infantry, the Russian tank attacks had faltered very badly when they were heading towards Kharkiv, especially when they ran through densely forested patches where infantry tank hunting teams were able to do damages, where the drones etc. were able to do damages. So all that is being now done, and our broad anticipation, I will now come into details a little later, is that come spring, both sides will then try and resume the stalled offensives. Meanwhile, in winter, the Russians are going to launch a major offensive in terms of interdiction to try and damage the Ukrainian power infrastructure. It will achieve two things. The power infrastructure will cause the people to freeze, with the discomfort levels to the civil population would be unimaginable in this freezing harsh winter, not only in Ukraine, equally because of the lack of gas in Europe per se, in Germany, in France, in England, all over Europe. The countries are going to suffer in a major way because of the lack of gas, because of the lack of heating. Their industries are going to suffer, the smelting industries which were being converted to natural gas, and it will take them 4 to 5 years to switch to natural gas from other sources, whether from Qatar, whether from the United States. And the simple fact is that anything that comes from the United States, any gas, will be 5 times more expensive than the gas that they were getting from such close proximity, spatially close proximity from Russia. So that is a broad kind of a perspective that I have tried to sketch of what is likely to happen. But before I get into details, I would like to now try and draw attention to what exactly are the changes that we have noticed in war fighting per se. Now, the simple fact is that the sheer intensity, scale and duration of the Russia-Ukraine war marks a significant paradigm shift in the very nature of war fighting per se. Right? It marks a dramatic shift away from low intensity conflict and the asymmetric wars of the last 50 years. The palpable break from the pattern of war fighting per se. Now, conflict now closely resembles the titanic tank battles, artillery, massive fire assaults that took place at the end of World War II, that took place in Eastern Europe, that took place in Germany, that took place on the gates of Berlin. Massive tank assaults preceded by weeks of artillery preparatory bombardments, rolling bombardments. We've come full circle back to World War II. As I said, the kind of thing to note is that India had inherited an armed forces structure to fight World War II. We had inherited that from the British. We had largely retained that organization till date. In the last 10 years or so, we were wanting to do very major changes. We still haven't done those changes. But thank God, in one way, it is a bit lucky that the world itself has come back, war fighting has come back to the era of the Second World War. And therefore, what we now have fits the bill. Please don't forget this. This is a very significant factor that I am trying to point out. Less the upgrades in technology, the structure, the methodology of war fighting has come exactly to what it was at the start of World War II, albeit instead of turboprops, you are using jets, albeit you are using, precision guided munitions and missiles. The levels of lethality have gone much harder. You need lesser equipment to impose greater amounts of lethality, especially if you are a defender. Now, in the dynamic between attack and defense, between tank and anti-tank weapons, between aircraft and anti-aircraft systems, we are seeing a new equilibrium that clearly favors the defender, right? And one of the war-winning factors that has emerged from this war is medium artillery. The Russians have fired over 3,600 tactical ballistic missiles, cruise, hypersonic missiles, and also, the so-called Shahid drones, the kamikaze drones, the loitering munitions. They all have been very heavily used. And the resultant scale of casualties and carnage has been simply unprecedented in our times. The Pentagon has claimed that both sides have suffered up to a lakh of casualties each, both including the wounded and the dead. The proportions normally are 30:70. So I suppose that general military proportion would hold for both sides, 30:20. But both Russia and Ukraine, as per the United States, as per the Pentagon Department of Defense, have suffered 100,000 soldiers each killed and wounded. Now, most military analysts feel that we are witnessing a pivotal moment in military history where we see the reascendance of the defense over the offense as a form of war. You see, the fact of the matter is that in conflicts prior to this, it was felt that if you had the initiative, you had the advantage. He who attacked first always had the advantage. At least he could choose when, where and how and in what quantum to attack. But now, after Ukraine, what is now becoming a little apparent is that the guy who attacks first pays a heavy price. And sometimes it may be smarter to let the other side attack first, inflict heavy damage, and once you have sort of weakened him, then you go on to the counter-offensive. This is exactly what Ukraine tried to do, and even Russia tried to follow up in Kherson and in the other areas. Battlefield transparency. Like I said, battlefield transparency has reached unprecedented levels in this war, right? They have never been higher in any past conflict. No other commander apart from the Ukrainians has had the benefit of so much and such transparent intelligence support as the Ukrainian General Staff. Like I said, 75 American and NATO military satellites, 200 civilian satellites covering the conflict area 24/7, good weather or bad, through cloud cover, through fog, mist, rain and snow. The battlefield is totally covered. Not a tank, not a truck, not a soldier can move without being detected. So the thing is that initially they were just following up, but now, as you noticed in the last 2 months, the Americans began to pick up the Russians withdrawing their forces. They had become smart to the idea that the Russians were using the same forces again and again and again by redeploying them in different sectors. So when the Russians started pulling out their troops from the Kharkiv sector towards the line of the Oskil River, the Americans warned the Ukrainians and they told them to exploit. Like I said, the rest is history. The Ukrainians launched 3 brigades, and as the Russians were withdrawing, they followed suit and gave an optical illusion of a massive, unprecedented victory. It was a bit of an optical illusion, but the fact was that the Russians cut a very sorry figure. I mean, they had to face uncalled for humiliation because of their refusal to deploy the force levels needed, which is in consonance with military common sense. But now they have done so and things are likely to change. So when you attack without surprise, I'd like to mention one more facet here. This war is a proxy war. United States and NATO are not fighting Russia directly but through Ukraine as a proxy. Had the war directly been between United States and Russia, NATO and Russia, the Russians would have blown out holes in the sky. The Russian anti-satellite weapons would have knocked out a fair number of critical American NATO satellites and perhaps vice versa, and blown holes in the sky so that they could cover their offensive operations. The Russians would have used their SAM 400, SAM 500, S-500 anti-aircraft missiles to shoot down the American AWACS, the American J-stars, which do sideways slant coverage of Russian territory, of Ukrainian territory. But they have not been able to do that. The entire assets, intelligence assets of America and NATO are unmolested. And they can unmolested carry out their work at peace. The satellites, of course, are flying all over, but their American aircraft, their reconnaissance aircraft can, even from the neighboring countries like Romania, etc., Poland, etc., they can cover the whole of Ukraine. This is an advantage no other military adversary has had so far of this level of intelligence battlefield support, as also not only just imagery support, but also electronics snooping. The Americans have been snooping onto the mobile networks, radio networks of the Russians. They have given away the location of the key Russian commanders, and the Ukrainians claim to have killed 9 Russian commanders in this war. Now the problem is that war will never remain the same because of this. Given the scale of casualties, we will have to focus hard on force preservation, reconstitution of badly battered units, and quick replacement of casualties in future wars. Wars will henceforth be a test of national will and stamina. Stamina to stay the course. We were told this is the era of short duration, high intensity conflict. No conflict can last more than 10 to 15 days. Otherwise, there is the danger of nuclear escalation. Nuclear escalation has proved to be a major hoax. The Russians have 6,000 weapons. They have been saber rattling. They have been threatening. Yes, they've got people worried. But the simple fact is they haven't fired a single nuke in anger. Number one. Number two, they haven't even moved nuclear weapons to firing positions, which would have given the others an indication, yes, now they are serious and they are going to do. So this has a whole lot of implications, especially in the India-Pakistan equation. The last government in Delhi was petrified of Pakistani nuclear weapons. They felt that even if one Indian soldier crosses the other side, one plane goes over to retaliate for a terrorist attack, there would be a nuclear Armageddon in South Asia. Nonsense. Based upon what we have seen, when even a country with 6,000 nuclear weapons did not dare to use a single nuke, will Pakistan with 160 odd, most of them tactical nuclear weapons, dare to use it against India in a all-out conflict? Well, there are now serious question marks and doubts. Unfortunately, what you see is both Russia and Ukraine are raising new forces. They have started arming and equipping new force levels. So the simple fact is that this is the very wrong time for any country to downsize. Unfortunately, we in India have just done that in the last 2 years. Over the last 2 years of COVID, on the pretext of COVID, we refused to recruit any new soldiers. Each year, 60,000 Indian soldiers die. This is now the third consecutive year without recruitment. So India the Indian army is short of 1,80,000 troops. 180,000 troops we are short of at a time when the threats from China are at their peak, when the threat from Pakistan has not receded in any way. They are stirring the pot in Punjab. They are trying to create trouble in Jammu and Kashmir, revive terrorism in both these K2 provinces. And I fail to understand on what basis we chose to downsize the Indian army in such a dire scenario. We will have to make it up, because if there is one lesson from the Russia-Ukraine war, that you cannot afford a lack of manpower. You cannot afford a paucity of manpower on the battlefield. Napoleon had said, God is on the side of the big battalions. And if there is equivalence in terms of equipment, then I am afraid being short of manpower is a disaster. Can prove to be a disaster. It has proved to be quite painful for the Russians. Let us learn from the experience of others. Let us not learn at our own cost. I would like to point out that Pakistan had 4 strike corps. 4 strike corps, that is the ARN, Army Reserve North, Army Reserve South. They had the 11 and the 12 corps. So 4 strike corps, 4 strike elements were there. India in answer had 3. It's another fact that our 2 corps was the equivalent of more than 2 of their corps. It was a huge corps that we have. But out of that, the 1 corps has now gone to the Chinese front. And therefore, we need to fill up these gaps. Now to work on a premise that peace has dawned. It has not. The world is heading towards an era of more and more wars and conflicts. What has happened in Ukraine, Russia-Ukraine could just be a precursor to further conflicts in the Taiwan Straits, in South China Sea, in the East China Sea, in the Sea of Japan, etc. So, we could have conflicts breaking on between Azerbaijan and this thing. Conflicts could break out with Iran. The world is heading towards an era of increasingly greater levels of conflict. So, we cannot afford to downsize, we cannot afford to reduce defense budgets. In such an era, pinching pennies would be penny wise but severely pound foolish. Severely pound foolish. This is a new era of not just high tech, but high tech and mass. Please, I'll repeat this. This is not just an era of high tech, this is a new era of high tech and mass. Mass to stay the course over months. Mass to stay the course in terms of national stamina. And nations that wish to prevail in such unrelenting, long duration wars will have to generate the manpower required to prevail in such intense and long duration grinds of attrition. Wars will increasingly be a test of national will and stamina to stay the course. As I mentioned, 70% of India's cutting-edge military equipment is of Russian origin. 60% of our tank fleet is T-72s. Balance 30% is T-90s. Right? Bulk of our Air Force, Su-27, Su-30s, and MiG-29s, etc., MiG-21s, they are all of Russian origin. Our artillery bulk is of Russian origin. Our Navy, quite a bit of it is of Russian origin. It's only now that the Indian Navy has made huge strides in indigenization, and now they are not buying a Navy, but they are building a Navy. But the fact of the matter is that we are heavily dependent upon Russian cutting-edge military equipment. So, no other country has a greater stake in learning lessons from this war than India. Because exactly the same weapons we will be deploying all over again. The simple fact is that what the economic lessons of this war are going to be far more important than even perhaps the kinetic lessons that we have learned from this war. The world over, the globe is facing severe recession. This could get coupled with stagflation. You have energy inflation, you have food inflation, you have fertilizer inflation. They may have come down a bit, but if once again there is a cap placed on the price of Russian oil, Russia could withdraw a whole lot of oil from the market, and when about 300,000 barrels, the world is facing a deep recession and stagflation. There is, as I mentioned, inflation, energy inflation, severe energy inflation, food inflation, fertilizer inflation. These may have come down a bit in the last month or so, but the fact is, if the cap put on Russian oil is enforced and Russia decides to withdraw a whole lot of oil from the global market, exactly what will happen is what is likely to repeat itself as had happened about 4 or 5 months back. Russia had taken off 300,000 barrels of oil from the global market, and the price of oil had shot down from $70 a barrel to about $120, $130 a barrel. So we could sort of again have another energy shock coming in this particular way. And like I said, I would now like to make a very significant prognostication, and that stems from the fact that it is our hypothesis that this conflict was deliberately triggered by United States and NATO with a view to almost forcing Russia to attack Ukraine by constant provocations, constant pokes in the eye, constant needling. Russia was pushed and provoked into attacking. Its red lines were violated with impunity, and it looked like that they would not stop till Russia retaliated. Why was that? Because the fact is that the United States wanted to do to the Russian Federation what they had done earlier to the Soviet Union. Don't forget that in the year of the Lord 1991, the Soviet Union had collapsed down the tube of history without a single shot being fired. Russia then had, or the Soviet Union then had, 10,000 nuclear warheads, but they were of no avail as Russia just collapsed economically. The Soviet Union did not collapse economically on its own. This was an induced collapse. Don't forget that the world had witnessed an oil shock in 1973, right? And as a result of that oil shock, the world had faced a recession. Quite obviously, the world decided to come together to reduce their dependency on Middle Eastern oil by turning to nuclear energy, natural gas, coal, etc., conservation measures. And in about 10 years, they were able to substantially bring down their dependence on Middle Eastern oil. That is the time the United States in 1986 forced Saudi Arabia to put the price of oil in free fall. In 6 months in 1986, the price of oil fell from $30 a barrel to just $10 a barrel, which was the price in the 1930s. Now, this steep decline in the price of oil destroyed the Soviet economy. It was a single product economy. It was based on the export of oil and gas, and primarily oil at that time. And once the price of oil fell down the tube, the Russians had to switch off their gas pipelines. Now, those gas pipelines are subject to permafrost. If the oil is flowing, it's okay, but if the oil stops flowing, these pipelines can burst, a lot of damage can take place. It was this that destroyed the Soviet economy and not Afghanistan. It was this concerted economic warfare that destroyed the Soviet economy. Our hypothesis is that the Americans wanted to repeat the economic war against the Russian Federation, to do to it what had been done earlier to the Soviet Union. But history repeats itself as tragedy and then as farce. It happens first as tragedy and then reoccurs as a farce. And this time when the sanctions were applied, the result has been quite the opposite of what was anticipated. The countries of Europe has suffered the worst because of the sanctions that have been applied on Russia. So a little aspect of this economic war, whose outcome will be far more crucial than the outcome of the kinetic war, is in order when we prognosticate about the future. How do you fight economic sanctions? The Russians had prepared for this economic sanctions. They had built a war chest of $600 billion of foreign reserves. Unfortunately, $300 billion of this were in American banks and in European banks, which have just been grabbed by the Americans, and the Soviet and the Europeans have grabbed the Russian money. What will happen from it? Global trust has been severely eroded. Do you see China now putting their money in American or European banks? Would Russia ever put their money again in American or NATO banks? Would India, for that matter, be very comfortable putting money in these banks, and suddenly one fine day when things go south, we find that all our money has gone up into smoke? The basis, the globalization, the global banking system is premised upon trust. This trust has been destroyed. The second is, of course, the factor of what I would say, the second is the factor of what I would call the capitalization. You see, capital controls. Russia has carried out forced capital conversion. Russia has carried out forced capital conversion in that they forced all countries to pay for their oil and gas exports in rubles. Now Europe, despite all the sanctimonious preaching to India to cut out all imports of oil and gas from Russia, themselves they have been buying all their oil and gas from Europe as hitherto without a break, for the simple reason that to switch from Russian gas to any other will take them at least about 4 to 5 years of creating the capital infrastructure. So they have been buying to the tune of $1 billion a month of gas and oil from Russia. The cost of the war to Russia has been $1 billion a month. So the war has entirely been paid for by the European Union. This was the one master stroke. The price of the Russian ruble vis-a-vis the dollar had fallen from $80 a ruble, 80 rubles to a dollar to 160 rubles to a dollar. Now this has again come back to 60 rubles to a dollar, and the ruble is today the best performing currency against the American dollar, right? And this is a very critical factor which shows that the American sanctions, the European sanctions, the countries that have been worst affected are the countries of Europe, and they are going to suffer intensely in the coming winter due to the shortage of gas. No heating for the common people. The smelting industries of copper, aluminium, etc. will all take a hit. A number of them will be forced to shut down, etc. A lot of other facets, power generation is going to take a hit, and Europe is headed for a very severe winter. Even the American economy, inflation is at a 40 years high. The price of oil had crossed $5 a gallon, and there is severe inflation of energy, food, fertilizer, everything in the United States itself. And those, because they have the luxury of printing dollars, they may so far have not had the kind of pain that Europe has suffered. But the differential between Europe and the United States, you find that there is a lot of bickering now emerging from Europe as to why they should carry the can, why they should pay the heaviest price for the American sanctions on the Russians, and if the price has to be entirely borne by the Europeans, well, beyond a point, there are going to be problems for the regimes in Europe. At the end of the day, they are democratic regimes and they have to face their own population. In the short term, sanctions have boomeranged. Will it be so in the long term? That is the critical question. You see, right now, Russia may have been able to get away with its responses, very well thought out responses to the well war-gamed responses to the American and the NATO sanctions. But that cannot continue forever. 4 and 5 years down the line, will the economic sanctions start to bite? And if they start to bite heavily into the Russian economy, well, then will Russia go down tamely a second time? This is the most important prognostication about the course of the Russia-Ukraine war. 3, 4, 5 years down the line, if these sanctions, if they are continued and if there is no ceasefire, there is no negotiated settlement, if these sanctions continue, will it begin to bite into the Russian economy? Well, yes, it will. And if so, then what are Russia's options? Will Russia agree to sink tamely a second time, go down the tube of history without a whimper, like the Soviet Union went with 10,000 nuclear weapons in its arsenal? It could do nothing. Will history repeat itself? I'm sorry, I have serious reservations on that score. Russia will be faced with a use them or lose them syndrome. If this Russian economy is hit to the extent of 40 to 50%, it will face a decision dilemma. Use its nuclear weapons or lose them. Sink tamely, to satisfy your enemies in United States and NATO, go according to their plan and crumble without a shot being fired, as the Soviet Union had gone down the tube of history, been flushed down the tube of history, or have a cataclysmic response. What is more likely the second time around? With hindsight, the Russians had seen what had happened to them earlier, to the Soviet Union. I don't think they will let the same thing happen again, because they have also learned their lessons from history. So then is when the world will face a serious point of Armageddon. If the Russian Federation thinks it is going to be economically destroyed, will it let itself be destroyed tamely without doing damage in retaliation to those who have caused its economic destruction? Even the Pakistani nuclear doctrine, one of the conditions that it lays down is for use of nuclear weapons if it faces economic destruction. So I'm sure the Russians have factored in, and now Putin had made a statement a few days back that they are going to reconsider their no first use pledge or their doctrine of nuclear use. They had said that they would use nuclear weapons at a first in terms of existential crisis, and nothing could be a greater existential crisis than 40 to 50% destruction of the Russian GDP. The more important war to watch, even more than the conventional war, is the economic war and the way it will go and the way it will unfold. Because the fate of the world could perhaps hang in the balance then. So to sum up, in terms of conventional military war fighting, what are we likely to see? We are seeing a winter pause. In the winter pause, the Russians are going to intensify the pressure on Ukrainian power infrastructure, Ukrainian railway grid, so that Ukraine's capability to switch forces around when the resumption of fighting starts in the month of February, March, spring, when we anticipate the next round of fighting, that would severely be destroyed. The fact is that in this war, we have seen an amazing underutilization of the Russian Air Force. which was so superior to the Ukrainian, and yet because of the intensity of the air defenses, they have not been used in the mass. Because of the free availability of Stingers and shoulder-fired missiles, they have not been used in the mass because very expensive platforms would be lost. The Russians have therefore relied far more upon their Iskander missiles, their Kalibir cruise missiles, their Yakhonts, and also their their drones to carry out the interdiction. There was only a one-day SEAD campaign. The peak level of Russian air sorties had been confined to 250 to 300 at their peak. You just compare this with the American sorties in Gulf War I, 1,650 per day. In Yugoslav campaign, 600 plus per day. Even India in the 1971 war had averaged about 480 sorties per day. So the fact is that this level of unutilization of Russian air power may actually not just be a problem with Russia. Even if the Americans and the NATO countries have to fight a full-scale air war next with an opponent of matching capability, matching air defense capabilities, with the S-400s, S-500s, the level of loss of manned aircraft could be stupendous. You may not want to risk that level of loss, and you also might like to confine your attacks to cruise missiles and unmanned precision guided munitions. So the fact of the matter is that they have underutilized their air power, but they are likely to increase use of missile power. So there would be this gap in winter. They will turn the screws on Europe in terms of the supplies of gas and energy, and Europe is likely to have a miserable winter, which could induce political dissensions in the kind of consensus that is there in the NATO now, in the EU now, to support the war against Ukraine. To support the Russian war, to support Ukraine in the war that Russia is waging against it. But there could be cracks in the alliance. Come the month of spring, there could be cracks in the alliance. There could be clamor for a ceasefire. There could be clamor for a negotiated settlement. That is the right psychological time for the Russians to launch their spring offensive. And even the Ukrainians are being armed and prepared, and they are also increasing their wherewithal. But the fact of the matter is they have a population base of 45 million. How much of casualties that can sustain non-stop? Ukraine has lost 40 to 50% of its GDP already. That is courtesy the loss of the entire coastline of the Sea of Azov and the Black Sea. With that coastline gone, 40 to 50% of Ukrainian GDP is gone. So far, they have gotten about $40 billion from United States, from the EU countries, and they have been kept afloat. The fact is, how long will they keep them afloat? And after they keep them afloat, and let us say once the war stops, how about the costs of reconstruction? Who is going to bear them? So the fact is, the question will be decided in the economic battlefield. The questions will all be decided in the economic battlefield, but the fact is that we, in the military battlefield, we anticipate a major escalation come spring, and hopefully that escalation should be able to propel the world towards a solution, final solution to this conflict, because otherwise the world as a whole is going to suffer. We cannot interminably afford a war that goes on and on for years and that causes such widespread recession and stagflation at a global scale. The poorer countries, we are already seeing the collapse of Sri Lanka. Pakistan could be next. Other poorer countries in Africa and other South America could follow, and therefore the world has to call a halt. The right psychological movement to try for peace also would come after Russia has launched its offensive, and a second pause for catching their breath happens after spring fighting next year. This is our prognosis Once again, I repeat and re-emphasize, the real battlefield will be the economic battlefield. What will happen if these sanctions continue for 4 to 5 years? What will happen if they take a 40 to 50% toll of the Russian GDP? And if that happens, will Russia feel threatened enough? Would Russia deem it an existential threat to be forced to use of its nuclear arsenal? That is a very critical question, the answer to which I don't think it is very easy for anyone to prognosticate at this stage. We only hope that things do not come to such a pass when we have such an either or equation. Thank you.